It's the Maxwell Institute podcast. I'm Blair Hodges. There's been a lot of discussion recently about the idea of religious freedom, so I invited two scholars to join me in this episode to talk about the related concept of religious toleration. Beneke and Christopher Grenda co-edited a new book called The Lively Experiment, Religious Toleration in America, from Roger Williams to the Present. Questions and comments about this and other episodes can be sent to MIPodcast at byu.edu. Okay, Chris and Christopher, thanks for joining us today on the Maxwell Institute podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Our pleasure, Blair.
Let's begin quickly by talking a little bit about how this book came about. The book is called The Lively Experiment, Religious Toleration in America, from Roger Williams to the Present. And this is a book that you both co-edited. So talk about the origins of the book.
We were invited to a conference, actually to a series of organizing sessions ahead of a conference about religious toleration in Rhode Island, specifically commemorating the 350th anniversary of the 1663 Rhode Island Charter. And this was sponsored by the Newport Historical Society, and they put together a series of events with local organizations, and one of which was a conference, a scholarly conference that was focused on the history of religious toleration.
How did the participants get selected? Did they submit papers, or how did that come about?
Yeah, they submitted papers. So we sent out a call for papers. People submitted to them. We selected from that cohort and put them together into the panels, as you typically do for academic conferences. And we had a couple of additional speakers. But it was a way of bringing together people who otherwise might not have known one another or even of one another, to get them into the same rooms to talk about the history of religious toleration, something that only happened on a few occasions in the past.
Anything to add?
Yeah, just in terms of bringing together scholars who may not have known or known of each other, the scholars ranged across several centuries worth of historical material. So from the 17th century all the way through the 20th century. And so as much as sometimes we end up in our own little niches, chronological niches historically, chronologically the conference was quite broad, spanning centuries. And it was also international. Several scholars coming from overseas. So it really did bring together a whole breadth of participants that led to a rich volume.
So it's looking at the idea of religious toleration in America from Roger Williams to the present time. And I thought we could start here by talking about this classic story that a lot of people might carry around in their back pockets of America being founded as a place of religious freedom, and the heroic pilgrims and puritans who fled to the American continent in order to find refuge from persecutors and establish this place of religious freedom for everyone. And before we dig into some of the specifics about that, perhaps you could speak broadly about this narrative and how it came to be told this way, and speak a little bit to its accuracy.
Well, in many ways, actually, it is a true story in that people did flee from religious persecution in the 16th, 17th century, especially the 17th century and early part of the 18th century, from places in Europe that didn't accommodate their forms of faith. But what they sought and what they oftentimes created in the colonial world was not the sort of haven for religious freedom that we might imagine it was. In fact, very often, especially in the case of colonial New England, where the Puritans dominated, these were places of religious oppression where there was a good deal of coercion when people were compelled to go to church, in a very specific church, the Reformed Calvinist church that dominated there. Elsewhere in Virginia, people were also forced to pay for the support of the Anglican church. So even when people fled from repressive situations in Europe, what they got in colonial America was not always the freedom that we oftentimes associate with that world. But there were exceptions, and I don't know if you want to talk about that.
I think that's part of the interesting dynamic that's going on in colonial America is that even though much of colonial America wasn't this safe haven for religious conscience, as Chris B. just outlined, there were certainly cases, provinces, Rhode Island being one, Pennsylvania being another, which relative to Europe at the time did offer much more expansive freedoms for religious conscience and religious dissent. Now, they don't quite live up to the level of religious liberty we tend to think in terms of today. But in terms of their context in the 17th and 18th century, they certainly were, well ahead of their time. And so part of it is kind of striking this balancing act. We're recognizing now that the old myths about colonial America as being a safe haven for religious conscience, where those myths no longer hold water, but at the same time recognizing certain pockets, such as Rhode Island or Pennsylvania, that were in their own time unique.
I think Roger Williams is a key figure in the story here to kind of give a little bit of nuance, because he came to the American continent seeking religious freedom, but encountered difficulties here. So he kind of exemplifies both sides of this coin that you're talking about. The fact that people did come here seeking religious tolerance, but at the same time, it wasn't completely tolerant for everyone who came. So let's talk about Roger Williams. I think what might surprise people is to find out that he himself wasn't this sort of peace-loving hippie type of guy that was like, let's all hold hands and everybody get along. He was also extremely confrontational and dogmatic himself. So let's talk a little bit about Roger Williams's role. Chris, why don't you start?
You're absolutely right. Roger Williams was a truly dogmatic character who had difficulty tolerating people in his own intimate circle who didn't agree with him completely. He was somebody who took religion very, very seriously and thought, partly for that reason, that people should be able to worship as they please, that it was a matter between God and their own souls. And as a result, the state should have no role, even individual communities, in mediating between the conscience of the soul and God. And so his conception of religious freedom, though, was based on a dogmatic faith that he would not compromise, again, even within his own family, was also one that had the ultimate result of creating freedom and tolerance for people in Newport, Providence, and across Rhode Island.
Go ahead, Christopher.
Yes, just to add to that, there's a theme running throughout the volume that starts with Roger Williams, and it relates this sharpness of tongue that he sometimes has, or often had, in relation to those who disagreed with him religiously. He could, in terms of his public expression, be very uncivil in terms of how he characterized the beliefs and ideas of others, and this notion of incivility with Roger Williams, and later on in the volume and with other groups. The notion of incivility or uncivil expression, pushing the boundaries of religious toleration, challenging the norms of politeness in society or polite expression in society. So we see this with Roger Williams in the mid-17th century, and just to fast forward to the mid-20th century, one of the essays deals with the Jehovah's Witnesses. And that same type of kind of aggressive proselytizing, often taking direct aim at the beliefs of others. Jehovah's Witnesses often took direct aim at the beliefs of Catholics as well as other groups. But in so doing, challenging or pushing the boundaries of toleration in ways that ultimately proved, at least legally speaking, constructive, expanding the boundaries, at least in one direction, of religious liberty. So that's a theme that starts with Roger Williams in the volume, and several essays in the volume come back to that theme across time.
And I think that's still really relevant, too. Religious people today might be conflating tolerance with open acceptance, right? Today, do you think it's possible to mistake public criticism as a lack of religious tolerance? Are there instances of religious groups believing that the principle of tolerance should shield them from public scrutiny?
There's a lot in that question. One way to try to begin to think through it is the phrase religious tolerance on the one hand, and then simply the word tolerance on the other. And it's hard to really date this, but last 30 or 40 years, the word tolerance increasingly standing on its own, apart from simply religious tolerance, and therefore meaning tolerance of all sorts of social identities. And the more tolerance kind of is standing on its own as a public norm, the tolerance of various identities, the more this strain of incivility, of uncivil expression is coming under criticism, because the more one is, let's say, less than civil in one's expression of one's beliefs and criticizing the beliefs and ideas in others, therefore the less tolerant one is, according to that kind of freestanding concept of tolerance.
Right.
So in some ways, in some ways, it seems like the phrase religious tolerance has, I don't want to say completely gone out of vogue, but often the word tolerance simply stands on its own now. And so we're in a situation where it seems like religious liberty on the one hand and tolerance on the other are increasingly coming into conflict in the early 21st century.
Chris?
Yeah, in some ways you could even say that that was true in Roger Williams' age, and that is, I'm not sure that he would have embraced something that we call tolerance necessarily. I mean, and did he even use that phrase, Chris? I don't know. Or that word?
That's a good question. Did he even use the word tolerance? If he did, it was rare. At least
toleration was a common one. Yeah,
right.
in the 17th
Freedom
century.
of
Liberty,
conscience
obviously.
or something like that was much more a phrase that he was much more in vogue. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think like religious liberty might have been something the phrase he used more often, right?
Yeah, and rights of conscience and rights of private judgment. So he reserved those things to himself, and he was tolerant in many ways. He possessed the characteristic of tolerance, and according to our own understanding, and that is that he would have allowed people into his society, and did, who were not only not Protestant, but were not Christian. And that was really pretty extraordinary for that day and age. And yet, as Chris points out, he was totally uncivil about it. He would tell you point blank if he thought you were wrong. And he would tell you in a really antagonistic way. I mean, he did not hold back whatsoever. But that was as broad as you could be, as inclusive as you could be, probably at that moment, was to allow people into your society, give them the full privileges of your the full civil privileges, and yet to harangue them. And so it's a very different idea, I think, than we have today, as Chris points out, about how to treat those who differ with you.
It's almost like he felt that affording someone tolerance included giving them the respect of actually engaging in what they believed, and that might have included just outright opposition.
Exactly. Yeah. No, he had no compunction whatsoever about telling people he thought they were dead wrong.
So let's talk about the political situation and the 1663 charter that you mentioned that is part of the reason for the conference for this book. What was the political infrastructure that Williams operated in, and kind of how that impacted his settlement? Let's talk about the politics of it.
Well, most broadly, in terms of the burgeoning British Empire, 1663 is the beginning of the Restoration period in English history. The Stuart monarchy is restored to the throne, and Parliament begins passing laws for reestablishing the Anglican Church and laws for uniformity to that church. So in that broad context, we have the reassertion of monarchical power and a uniform Anglican Church. But as Evan Heffley points out in the volume, in one of the early essays in the volume, he puts that 1663 charter in global context, showing that how various parts of the British Empire, that under Charles's prerogative, the king's prerogative, how various parts of the empire were allowed a certain religious toleration, or the coexistence of different religious groups. So at home, you have this uniformity. At home, meaning in England, you have this uniformity being reimposed, and yet in certain parts of the empire overseas, certainly not all parts, but in certain parts of the empire overseas, you have certain experience with some forms of religious toleration. So Williams is working in that kind of broad context, but then more locally in Massachusetts, he's coming up against the Puritan authorities, who increasingly are having problems with his rigid understandings of orthodoxy and emerging understandings of the separation of church and state, which lead him to flee Massachusetts and set up shop in Rhode Island.
And he kind of wanted like governmental support of that, right? This idea of charter. What good would a charter do for him?
It would have guaranteed Rhode Island some degree of sovereignty, would have ensured that they could conduct legislative matters on their own, and established a stable relationship with the rest of the empire. So it gave them a degree of discretion that they wouldn't have otherwise had, and a predictability in their affairs that they wouldn't have otherwise had.
One of the things you write in the introduction, you say, though the Charter accords with some critical modern presumptions about society and politics, that document also confronts today's readers with the utter strangeness of 17th century thinking. So, Chris, talk a little bit about that, the idea that there's some things that modern readers, as they read this Charter, would really resonate with, and other things that would seem very unusual for a political document.
Yeah, well, obviously, when they talk about allowing for a lively experiment in Rhode Island and allowing people to pursue their own religious consciences, to follow the dictates of their conscience, that seems like something that we can all agree with. That does resonate with the modern age. And yet, there were these really what we would regard today as offensive comments made about Native Americans, poor, ignorant savages, I think the phrase was, who were supposed to be converted as a result of this charter and the efforts by Christians, European Christians in New England. So what their goal was at least their stated goal in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Virginia, was to bring Christianity to a land that seemed to them a wilderness of paganism and unbelief. And so it was a notion of religion that clearly presumes that one side is right, another is wrong, that they had the truth and others didn't. And so I think anybody who looks at the charter is going to find a couple of modern notions, a couple of things that will be familiar, but they will find also that much of what's there is unfamiliar, is mysterious. It just looks strange and doesn't accord with what we now believe about the world. So that I think explains some of the intrigue of this document in this age. And Roger Williams himself, he was a bit of an enigma, as was much of what he said and much of what was in that charter. An enigma to us, I should say.
Right.
Not his own age.
Yeah. Christopher, do you get the sense that there was any sort of religious mission behind Roger Williams as he put this charter together? I kind of got the sense that he was making an argument that this kind of negotiation between the church or between religion and state would actually foster greater religiosity, or would lead more people to embrace the true religion.
It would provide the opportunity, it would provide the space for proselytizing, for proselytizing on behalf of the Christian gospel. That notion of proselytizing, the expectation of winning converts, the assumption behind Williams's thought and the charter was that to proselytize effectively, to win converts to the gospel, required space, required civic space. And that civic space required the government to retreat out of that space, stop imposing religious uniformity. So there definitely is this very robust attitudes of proselytizing and conversion that inform both Williams's thought as well as the charter. In a way, the separation of church and state for him is getting state authority out of that space that would therefore be more open to that aggressive proselytizing which he at times engaged in.
How about this analogy that Roger Williams drew? He used an analogy of a ship at sea, and the ship at sea kind of represented the sort of ideal society that he was trying to experiment with, this lively experiment. So one of you talk about that church and state relationship ship analogy.
So the idea here is that everybody has basic obligations. In order for the ship's crew to operate effectively, in order for the ship to sail, there are certain responsibilities everybody must carry out. This is a metaphor for the civic obligations we all have, to pay our taxes, to serve on juries, things of that nature. But we are not obligated in a religious sense. That is, even though Williams may believe that we should be worshiping in a particular way, we do not owe the state anything in that regard. That we have the right to pursue our own particular religious views, to worship as we please. That will not influence the course of the ship. That will not send everyone to a watery grave. They have these civic obligations. Those are independent of what people believe.
Christopher?
Yeah, just adding to that, the notion of the ship, as Chris mentioned, the notion of the ship is kind of a metaphor for civic obligations, and so therefore Williams could fundamentally disagree with you regarding your beliefs. He could even think you're destined for hell because of your beliefs. But if your job on the ship was to mop down the deck, you could perform that job. You could perform your civic obligations. And so this notion that the ship, civil society, can float despite fundamental disagreements on religion is both a startling concept, a liberating concept, and hence it still kind of resonates with us today.
So I wondered how that analogy of church-state relations stacked up against later figures like the Baptist Isaac Bacchus and later on Thomas Jefferson, and how the views on the separation of church and state can be compared between Roger Williams and these later figures.
Well, Bacchus was, late 18th century American Baptist from New England, played a significant role in debates in Massachusetts over the Massachusetts state constitution in 1780 and thereafter. Bacchus is often credited as one of the revolutionary figures, one of the few revolutionary figures who actually read Roger Williams. Roger Williams wasn't exactly the most. His works were not exactly standard reading material for the famous founding fathers like a Thomas Jefferson or a James Madison. But in Bacchus, I think Bacchus represents a very strong strain in the founding, a strong evangelical strain. Groups of different, whether it be Baptist or Presbyterians, coming out of an evangelical tradition, who continue to have this sense that religious liberty, as they understood it, required this open civic space where they can proselytize, where they can seek converts, where they could try to spread the gospel, and that required the state to play an increasingly diminished role in religious affairs. So even though one cannot argue that Roger Williams had any huge impact on the American founding, because again his books are not widely read amongst the elite founders, nevertheless the kind of evangelical perspective he's coming from, the importance of proselytizing and such, and that requiring a religious liberty, that perspective certainly does play a significant role amongst many religious groups in the founding period, and most prominently among Baptists like Isaac Bacchus.
That's right. And the thing about Bacchus is and this goes back to your point earlier about the progress or lack thereof in the history of religious toleration, is that Bacchus actually had a more constricted view of who should or could participate in public affairs than Williams. Bacchus, writing nearly 120 years later, was uncomfortable with the idea that Roman Catholics would participate equally in the polity, that they would be permitted to serve in federal offices under the U.S. Constitution. So there was, in many ways, something that was much broader in Williams's thought, something much more inclusive than would be the case for many people, even those who shared his Baptist sentiments in decades and centuries of the past. Now Thomas Jefferson also shared Williams's view that church and state should be separate entities, that they should not encroach upon one another. But Jefferson was different in that he was inclined in his own thinking towards deism, or maybe even atheism. We don't really know. He was not trying to open up a space for proselytization necessarily, Christian proselytization, but to the open pursuit of truth, and thought that the separation of church and state would lend itself to that particular enterprise. Nonetheless, I think they probably would have agreed in probably 95% of church-state matters, those two, despite their very different conceptions of how humans should approach God.
So the picture that you're painting, it's the thing that sticks out to me now is people today that talk about the relationship between church and state, because it's still a very contested issue, could look back in history and select a particular figure and sort of crown them as a representative of the founding fathers, capital F, capital F. And there seems to be enough diversity of thought that almost anyone could kind of cherry pick instances of history to support current policy. Is that something that you think about very much as historians who are looking at the past in terms of the ways that it can end up being used today?
Short answer, yes. Just elaborating on that a little bit. The last 15 or 20 years, just for me personally, it's a humbling experience. The more one delves into the literature, the more one delves into records. One might, in graduate school, feel as though there might be clear answers to this issue of church and state in the founding and the First Amendment. And as you said, kind of cherry pick. I'll pick Jefferson. Somebody else might pick somebody else. But the more one really engages both the secondary literature and the primary sources, the more clear it is that there is no one principle coming out of the founding, with the possible exception or the exception of simply no federal establishment. There's no national church. I mean, that's something we could all agree upon. But just to take Jefferson as an example, the cherry picking happens not even between individuals, i.e. you take Jefferson, I'll take somebody else, but even within one individual. So when Jefferson was president, for example, he attended religious services in the Capitol building. It was part of, we talked about kind of incivility before, it was kind of part of Jefferson's sense of civility, of public civility. This is kind of a public decorum, this is what's expected, this is what I'll do. And oftentimes he reserved some of his most strident comments regarding religious orthodoxy, religious doctrine for private correspondence, as opposed to Roger Williams, who would make them public. So even in the character of Jefferson himself, we could read some of his articles and find principles of church and state certainly there, but then we can also look at some of his practices, such as attending religious services in the Capitol, and say, well, how do we make all this add up, and even that one figure, let alone the scores of other founders. To me, for me personally, it's a humbling experience. The humbling experience, the more one engages the sources, the less one is sure that one can come away with a clear principle that can settle all the disputes we're looking at today.
How about you, Chris Beneke?
Well, yeah, Chris is right that at the time there probably wasn't much of a consensus about how much religious liberty people should have, or how inclusive the state should be in terms of allowing people into public office, in terms of sponsoring religious programs or prayer and public bodies. The one thing that people did agree upon was that there should be no established church. A lot of them said they'd be comfortable with what was called a non-preferential establishment. That is, they'd be comfortable if there was support for religion, but it wasn't directed towards one particular church, and there weren't too many restrictions on believers. They were willing to tolerate or willing to carry over the old restrictions on Sunday activity, the Sabbatarian restrictions, so that which didn't permit people to work or to play on Sunday. Also, the old blasphemy restrictions, keeping people's speech in line. But what happened in the succeeding decades is that they moved away from that. So by the 1820s, 1830s, not only have they given up on the idea that there should be one single religious establishment, but increasingly what they were saying was that there should be no direct government support for religion. So it's a change that takes place over about a generation. So if you go back right to, say, 1776 or 1787, you will find a much higher proportion of founders probably willing, in the states as well as in the federal government, willing to countenance some degree of religious establishment, some explicit direct religious establishment. By the 1820s, most of that has gone away. People, by that point, do want religion in their public life, but it's a religion that's more diffuse, that operates through the courts or informally through culture, and not so much through people's tax payments. So there's a change that takes place, and if you don't pay attention to that change, if you assume that everybody's the same in 1776 as they are in 1820, or the same in 1763 as they are in 1790, then you'll miss a lot. It was an era that was changing rapidly, in which there was a good deal of disagreement.
And that disagreement sort of continues up to the present, as we'll talk about a little bit later on in the interview. I'm speaking today with Chris Beneke. He's an associate professor of history at Bentley University and author of the book Beyond Toleration, The Religious Origins of American Pluralism. We're also speaking with Christopher Grenda. He's a professor of history at Bronx Community College of the City University of New York. Among other books, he co-edited The First Prejudice, Religious Tolerance and Intolerance in Early America. Chris and Christopher are the editors of the new book, The Lively Experiment, Religious Toleration in America from Roger Williams to the Present. Let's zoom out a little bit. You mentioned earlier that this volume also takes a transnational look at the topic, and this is the chapter, the very first chapter that really that I really enjoyed in particular, because it introduced me to the idea that religious toleration was something that was important to the English government before. It wasn't a brand new thing born in the American context. It was transnational. So Rhode Island wasn't this lone experiment, or Pennsylvania and these types of places weren't just singular experiments, but rather there were other attempts at accommodating religious diversity in places like Barbados and Dunkirk. So let's talk a little bit about that chapter, about the wider context of religious toleration beyond the shores of America. Maybe Christopher, maybe you want to start on that, and then Chris, you can sound off.
Sure. As I briefly mentioned in passing a few moments ago, Evan Haefele really does set up the volume nicely with that opening essay, which puts the Rhode Island Charter in a global context. And so his work is tremendous in looking at places in the British Empire on different continents, whether it be European continent, Southeast Asia. And a lot of what he talks about there is the pragmatism of Charles II, the English monarch in the late 1600s, how he understands that there are religious differences in different parts of his empire, and that he'll use his royal prerogative. He'll use his royal prerogative to grant certain forms of toleration to different groups in different areas, including Catholics in certain parts of the empire. And so that first chapter really does highlight how Rhode Island, although it has some distinct characteristics, is not completely unique at this point in terms of having a coexistence of different religious groups. Those distinct characteristics, nevertheless, do somewhat remain, and I think those are distinct characteristics coming out of Roger Williams and his specific religious beliefs, and we've touched upon this about the proselytizing and conversion and such, and kind of this robust religious debate, religious disagreement. But Haefele does a great job in putting the Rhode Island Charter in this global context and giving the readers a real kind of panoramic view of some of the formulas of toleration that are there in the late 17th century. Over time, the volume will increasingly focus on the American context, but it does begin with this kind of broad perspective.
And one of the things that's extraordinary, too, about the 17th century, I think, and that may come as a surprise to modern readers, is how diffuse the British Empire was, and other European empires as well, and how informal they were, and how many different types of arrangements prevailed. There was not just one formula for all the colonies of the empire. There were a number of them, as Chris has alluded to, and these resulted in very different and oftentimes contradictory arrangements, where some groups got tolerated in one place but not another. So this means that the story we tell is rather complex, and more complex, I think, than a lot of people have known up until this point. What it also tells us is that what Evan Haefele's story about the 17th century also tells us is that there were differences within the British government itself, and the king oftentimes disagreed with Parliament, and within the spaces of those disagreements, people could find room for toleration. Sometimes this actually worsened things for dissenters when there was no strong authority, when the king was not able to exert his prerogative, when either popular prejudice or parliamentary acts limited royal authority. But over time, what we do see is a consensus developing towards toleration, partly because people thought colonies could not be populated or enriched without it. But a lot of diffusion, a lot of complexity. It's a story that takes shape, that unfolds in a variety of different ways, and will end. There's no, there's no one place. There's no one location that it's all destined to arrive at. The fact that we get religious freedom in the United States at the latter part of the 18th century has a lot to do with choices people made along the way and the complex arrangements that they built their church-state establishment on.
I was surprised to learn how much it was tied up in local economies. So there were areas where you would need labor, you would need people to come in and provide warm bodies. And so by opening up the gates to particular religious groups, you could bring people in to help. So there was a lot of pragmatism. And it also explained why there was a lot of different rules for different groups in different places.
No, I think that notion of pragmatism, not using it in the official capital P sense, but just in a kind of a colloquial lowercase sense, that's certainly something that seems to be on the upswing in the late 17th century, following the religious wars, the European religious wars, the 30 Years' War, but then also the Civil War in England, that many thinkers begin to try to ponder, well, we can't have societal breakdown like that. We can't have continued societal breakdown. So how are we going to have some kind of arrangement of coexistence between different religious groups? And so in terms of just political stability, but then also what you mentioned, kind of economic vitality. Well, if we're going to want our economy to thrive, and you mentioned like the city of Dunkirk, for example, this idea that, well, if we're going to want Dunkirk to kind of thrive as a commercial center like Amsterdam, then we have to let in different religious groups, because a lot of those religious groups are going to bring economic vitality, economic energy to our city. So both in trying to achieve some form of political stability following all those religious wars, but also having kind of a pragmatic approach to economic activity, there is this kind of upswing in lowercase pragmatic thought in the late 17th century.
Yeah, it's like a making do, an accommodation. Like, what can we do to just make this thing work?
Yes, exactly.
And along with that, and maybe even before it, there still has to be some recognition that people can disagree and still get along, because it all gets thrown out of the window. All those hopes for prosperity by bringing different groups into your society, all that will go out the window if there's conflict.
Yep.
But there's a dawning recognition that there might not be. That in fact, people might be able to get along despite their religious differences, and these things become sort of tied together over time. There's a mutually reinforcing dynamic that occurs where there's a recognition that you won't have conflict necessarily. You might get a little more prosperity, and before you know it, they're including wider and wider ranges of groups in their societies.
And I think an important part of that, just to add one more dimension to it, an important part of that, which we see in Williams and will increasingly see in the generations after Williams, even amongst many people who didn't read Williams, is reading Christian biblical text as warranting some kind of accommodation, as warranting or commanding some type of freedom of conscience. And so the more different religious communities, Protestant, Catholic, whatever, the more different religious communities begin to read biblical text in ways that, at least on a superficial way, resemble Williams in reading biblical text. That, look, biblical text requires that we find some kind of accommodation. The more that happens, the more it gets embedded in attitudes as generations come and go. I think that's an important dynamic, that interpretation of biblical text and what our own religion requires.
Yeah, that's what's interesting to see Roger Williams, which again is kind of symptomatic of his overall approach, which was thoroughly undergirded by his religious beliefs, is when one of the scriptures he went to was, he said, Christ insisted on letting the wheat and the tares grow together until the end, when God would sift those things out. So his argument there was, we aren't the ones to be deciding who's wheat and who's tares. And it's funny that he would use a religious scripture like that as a way to encourage more openness and diversity. And so it's kind of a paradox. Like, I'm using this. You kind of would have to agree with that scripture in order to agree with the reading of it, kind of a thing.
Well, I think it gets back to something that.
You go ahead. Yeah.
something gets back to something Chris B touched upon earlier, and that's the strangeness of the charter, but broadening that a little bit, the strangeness of Williams and Williams's thought to many readers today. That tares and wheat metaphor, and Williams takes that from the Gospel of Matthew. Much of Williams's his two major books, The Bloudy Tenent of Persecution, right? He gets into thick biblical interpretation regarding that passage, where his adversary, John Cotton, one of the Puritans from Massachusetts, is interpreting the passage, and Williams is interpreting the passage in different ways, but they're interpreting the passage by referencing other biblical passages, both in the Christian New Testament and the Christian Old Testament. It is thick theological exegesis. And for readers in the early 21st century, to read like The Bloudy Tenent of Persecution, it really is to enter into a strange world. And yet out of this strange world of thick biblical hermeneutics comes this idea that seems relevant to us, freedom of conscience.
Chris?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, again, if you dive into the Bloudy Tenent of Persecution and look for a quotable phrase on freedom of conscience, you need a lot of luck. I mean, you don't plan on just doing it and finding a passage randomly in there. You're going to have to search hard because it is encased in really thick biblical hermeneutics, as Chris points out. And I think this goes back to the point that there is this reciprocity between religious belief and the epistemology surrounding it and secular beliefs and epistemologies that end up producing a consensus about toleration. People like Williams are mingling the idea that you can have a secular state along with lots of religious people, which itself is not necessarily a Christian idea, at least not directly embedded in the Bible, along with deeply rooted biblical ideas about the end times and about the relationship between our souls and God, and these things come together in ways that allow people to tolerate those of different faiths and different beliefs.
You mentioned the secular element of things, and some people get the impression that the rise of secularism is just bent on doing away with religion. Is there a different story that can be told there, where the rise of the secular was yet another way to help make place for religious diversity?
Well, just as you're asking the question, I'm thinking of the work of Charles Taylor, where I hate to try to summarize, his thousands of pages of scholarship, and I'm far from any kind of expert on them. But going back to, let's simplify this a little bit. Going back to the ship metaphor we talked about earlier. Well, that is essentially a conception of the secular. That is a conception of civic obligations, not completely separate from religious beliefs. Religious beliefs happen there in that secular arena, but the secular arena doesn't depend upon your religious beliefs. I mean, you can be part of the same secular civic community, despite those different beliefs. I guess this is the long-winded way of answering your question in the affirmative. It somewhat depends upon how you define secular, but the notion of a secular space that's not dominated by one religious group or one religious interpretation, that doesn't require a particular belief to enter that secular space and be part of it, to become a citizen of that space, that does open up, that is a prerequisite for some conception of toleration or religious liberty. Now, of course, different people, though, define that secular space in very different ways. So underneath that kind of superficial consensus are very deep disagreements. But it does seem to be a prerequisite for some type of toleration or liberty.
Let's circle back for a second, back to the idea that these experiments in religious toleration and how they played out politically were kind of locally crafted, the fact that you can look at different locations and see different rules being applied. Christopher Jones was a contributor to this volume. He contributed an essay on Methodism and slavery. So as Methodism, it was a really strong missionary movement, and as it spread by missionaries on both sides of the Atlantic, slaveholders and government officials became increasingly wary of tolerating their activities. This is because they wondered if preaching to slaves could incite slave rebellions and things like that. So what was at stake here, and how did the dynamic of religious tolerance play out when we bring race and slavery into the discussion?
I think there were always limits to the extension of religious tolerance. In fact, I don't just think that. We know that there have always been limits to the extension of religious tolerance, and very often those limits are boundaries where people's interest and desire to extend liberty of conscience runs up against their concerns, their anxieties about public order. And you can see again and again in the history of religious toleration that people are willing to allow for toleration, liberty of conscience in various times and places to various degrees, to the degree that it does not rub up against public order. And George Washington, whenever he writes a letter to a congregation, as he often did in 1789, 1790, they'd write him a letter congratulating him on becoming the presidency. He'd write back, and he'd always include some qualification in endorsing their own religious liberty. He'd say, providing you have liberty of conscience, providing that you support the state in some form or another. And that you see too in the 20th century when it comes to Jehovah's Witnesses. That is, that people are allowed to worship as they please as long as they're not disturbing the public peace. Now, when it came to slavery and slave societies, this was the basis of the social order. So anybody who threatened the institution of slavery thereby threatened the social order, and so couldn't be tolerated. And that was true even of those who were interested in proselytizing, who tried to bring, as they saw it, Christianity to a benighted people, to an oppressed people. They were regarded not so much as proselytizers as instigators of rebellion, as potential disruptors of the social order. And so in slave societies, there was a different idea about of the social order, and therefore some people were excluded from the types of religious toleration, liberty, the church-state arrangements that were beginning to prevail elsewhere. It was a deeply threatening, just to proselytize among slaves was deeply threatening because public order depended on slavery.
Yeah, to that, I would add, just building on that notion of deeply threatening to the social order. Slavery, especially as it's developing in areas in the Caribbean that Christopher Jones analyzes, the kind of the modern plantation slave system requires such a control of a population that to give that population control over anything, in this case religion, would seem to kind of be pulling one of the bricks out of the foundation of the oppressive system. Mm-hmm. So, we could look at other areas of life to give, whether it be free or enslaved people of color, control over different areas of life, would just be a fundamentally threatening prospect when you're looking at these kind of large slave plantation systems. And I also think there's another element there, kind of element we can call historical consciousness. If you think about, for example, how as Americans, even if we're not experts on the subject, we can all kind of reference the notion of Jim Crow segregation in the South. So we might not even, so teaching, some students might not know much about it, but they kind of have some sense of what it is. So in a similar way, when looking at the 18th century historical consciousness, I think there's a general historical consciousness, especially among those in political power, of the religious wars of the 17th century. And even if you want to go back to the Reformation, some of the radical violence in the radical parts of the Reformation. So this notion that religion can be very destabilizing, especially if it's being practiced by unlicensed preachers, spreading certain kinds of Christian messages of free grace and Christian freedom. So I think that historical consciousness of the potential threat of proselytizing in evangelical religion is part of the reaction that Christopher Jones details in The Authorities and the reactions to Methodists in areas of the Caribbean.
It was also interesting to see the ways that Methodism and Methodists had to adapt too, because you had Methodist figures in America that could be a lot more forthright in condemning slavery and in sounding for their time quite progressive in the sense of seeking change in society. And then you had Methodists in the Caribbean and other places that had to put out fires as a result of those, types of sermons and say, "Oh, no, we're not here to talk about the abolition of slavery or anything like that. We're just here. In fact, we can help. We can help keep peace here and spread our faith this way." So you even saw within Methodism adapting to different circumstances. Another essay that I wanted to talk about was Christine Hutchison Jones's contribution, and hers focuses on how public perceptions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints shifted in the United States from about the 1940s to the 1960s. And it seems like her paper examines, along with what I just said about Methodism, ways that religious groups can increase their access to religious tolerance by making efforts to align themselves better with the prevailing culture. So what stood out to you in this essay about Mormonism?
Well, I think one of the themes that her essay highlights, and other essays also highlight this, and Blair, you just kind of touched upon it, is like this double-edged sword that if we track Mormons and their standing in the larger American community from the late 19th century through, let's say, the Eisenhower administration in the middle 20th century, their standing, their sense of respect certainly is on the upswing. In those decades, they're increasingly accepted as part of American society, all the way to the point where, as Christine Hutchison Jones indicates in her essay, the Tabernacle Choir is kind of seen by mid 20th century as kind of this distinctly American phenomenon, and so that highlights the extent to which Mormons have been accepted as tolerated, but that required on their part a certain assimilation to American norms, and so the vast majority of Mormons reject the older practice of polygamy in accommodating themselves to American norms. So I think that notion of tolerance and assimilation, that almost like to get the tolerance, a group like the Mormons had to assimilate to a significant degree. And we see this again. There are other essays in the book that address this. The essay on the Jehovah Witnesses talks about how their increasing tolerance after the 1940s is somewhat predicated upon them giving up their more aggressive forms of proselytizing, or at least toning down. I shouldn't say give up, but toning down their more aggressive forms of proselytizing. So that kind of double-edged sword that, yes, tolerance, greater acceptance, but that required a certain assimilation on the part of the minority religious group at the same time.
That's right, and I think that Chris is absolutely right in pointing out that polygamy was a key factor here, that giving up the doctrine of celestial marriage was one that, although some historians, I think, have famously and really intriguingly argued that was inconsequential, I think that there's a pretty strong correlation, and the relationship may in fact be causal between giving up that thing which was so different and so threatening to outsiders, to other Americans, and the acceptance of Mormons by within a couple decades after that, or at least the decreasing levels of tolerance followed by increasing levels of acceptance. It's hard to break down that alteration without seeing the relinquishing of celestial marriage as part of the equation, as a big part of the equation.
Yeah, and I think so too. And you see, of course, there's the 1890 manifesto that abolished or that stated that Mormons would cease practicing polygamy, and then it took another several decades for the practice itself to wind down. And then you have World War I, World War II, the rise of Latter-day Saint patriotism, and I think white culture had a big. Mormons were increasingly seen as sort of prototypical white middle-class Americans, and so you see this respectability emerge over the course of a few decades. It's really quite a swing. Yeah,
you do see with other groups. Jews are also experiencing a much higher level of inclusion in American society by the late 1940s. Now, that was partly as a direct result of World War II than they had in the latter part of the 19th century. So there are some more general trends that are occurring here as well. And Roman Catholics also.
Yeah.
If you look at, say, the treatment of Roman Catholic candidates during, like Alfred Smith during the 1928 election, as compared to John F. Kennedy in 1960. There's a real swing, whereas prejudice was widely accepted against Roman Catholics and Jews and Mormons in the 20s. By the 1960s, you are defining yourself as an outsider if you are prejudiced. It's no longer part of me and no longer an acceptable part of public mainstream culture. Not that it doesn't still abide, not that people don't have those bigotries, not that private conversations don't contain prejudicial remarks. It's just that it's not acceptable anymore to articulate them publicly.
Maybe you can speak on one thing. We talked about polygamy and the change there being crucial to the change in public perception of Mormons. Was there something similar in Catholicism? Earlier, I know people were very worried about the idea that Catholics were beholden to the Pope. And so the idea was they couldn't be true American citizens because their true ultimate allegiance was there in Rome. And so what changed in public perception of Catholics that brought them more into the mainstream?
Well, I think there, too, the process was very similar in that almost immediately after the Constitution, even before the Constitution was ratified, Roman Catholic leaders, especially John Carroll, the first Archbishop, Roman Catholic bishop, and then Archbishop in the United States, almost as soon as that occurred, he and others were defining the Roman Catholic Church in America as very different from its European counterparts, as committed to Republican ideals, as aloof from the civil injunctions of the Pope as could possibly be, and said, listen, we have fought with you as fellow citizens. We have shed blood in this cause. We want to be part of this republic, and we are not going to be introducing foreign elements into our political decisions, our political participation. We want to be defined as a religious people, not as a religious people with commitments, political commitments someplace else. And on those terms, Protestants, late 18th, early part of the 19th century, went along with their growing inclusion in American society. It wasn't without road bumps, especially in the 1830s and 40s, as anti-Catholic sentiment reemerged with the onset of Irish Catholic immigration. But nonetheless, Roman Catholics will remain in politics and central to American society from that point forward. It was a redefinition of the faith as something that was not political and thereby not threatening the Republican government that did it.
Christopher?
No, I was just going to add something from a much later time period. Immediately after World War II, or Chris B. referred to John F. Kennedy in 1960, but of course in the 1960 campaign, he has to explicitly say that his political views are independent of the papacy or independent. So he still has to make that argument in 1960, which suggests that that there are still questions or concerns there. But nevertheless, if you look at like World War II, so Chris B. just took the Revolutionary period. And I'll just take like the post-World War II period, where you have a lot of Catholics here in the United States now that have come from Eastern Europe, now under Soviet control, and so the emerging containment consensus. Well, Catholics play a significant role in this, and they are what's the word I'm looking for? They're sympathetic figures in that they are becoming anti-communist because their homeland, i.e., Poland, is now under Soviet control. So there's that anti-communist containment consensus is forming here in America. Catholics are certainly part of that. And then when we get into the 1950s, prominent Catholics making robust intellectual arguments about religious freedom and religious liberty. That certainly contributes to kind of a distinct Catholic voice in America.
That's Christopher Grenda. He's a professor of history at Bronx Community College of the City University of New York. And we're joined also by Chris Beneke, associate professor of history at Bentley University. And together they edited The Lively Experiment, Religious Toleration in America from Roger Williams to the Present. We'll take a quick break and be right back for the conclusion of the interview. One of the hardest parts of preparing a great lesson for Sunday school or seminary class or family home evening is coming up with good questions to ask about the scriptures. We've all heard teachers ask questions that seem to fall flat. Most of us have been teachers who've asked stale questions, and the class sits there in silence because everyone knows the answer but nobody wants to say it. The real key to an engaging lesson is having good questions. That's what makes the Maxwell Institute's Scriptures Made Harder book series so valuable. These aren't books that you sit down and read straight through. They're tools. They're workbooks that you can use right alongside your scriptures. Instead of telling readers exactly what to think, they're filled with questions that prompt deeper reflection. So we have the New Testament made harder, and we also have the Old Testament, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Book of Mormon made harder as well. Each book is available in print and digital formats. For more information, go to maxwellinstitute.byu.edu/madeharder. We're back with Chris Beneke and Christopher Grenda. Both of them edited the book, The Lively Experiment, Religious Toleration in America from Roger Williams to the Present. And there's a whole lot of things in this book that we don't have time to talk about today, but I wanted to conclude the interview by talking a little bit more about present-day applications. And religious toleration is a value it's held in tandem with other values that kind of seem to compete with it. So maybe you can speak for a moment about some of the tensions that still exist with the principle of religious toleration in comparison with other values, primarily in the United States. And Christopher, why don't you start?
In many interesting ways, we see this concept now of tolerance and religious liberty in conflict. One interesting case that's been in the news recently, and it kind of reminds me, we were talking about Isaac Bacchus earlier, it reminds me a bit of Isaac Bacchus. This case regarding a lawsuit involving the Little Sisters of the Poor, that the Little Sisters of the Poor wish not to participate in the contraception mandate that's part of the Affordable Care Act. And the administration basically offering the Little Sisters of the Poor a waiver. If they simply sign the waiver, that their insurance premiums won't go to the contraception mandate. But the Little Sisters of the Poor refused to sign the waiver on the basis that our religious liberty, our religious conscience doesn't require us or doesn't allow us to sign a waiver offered by the state. Well, in a way, this was the situation, at least a faint resemblance to Isaac Bacchus. Massachusetts authorities said to Isaac Bacchus, look, we're going to have a system of religious taxation here in Massachusetts, but you Baptists can be exempted from it. You just need to sign a certificate saying you're a part of the Baptist. You don't need to participate in the religious taxation system. And so we won't collect taxes from you, religious taxes from you. And Bacchus took the position of no, that my religious conscience forbids me to have to sign a document provided by the state in order to practice my religion. And so just fast forwarding back to today, these arguments about religious liberty, the free exercise of religion, which is the position the Little Sisters of the Poor are taking, versus this issue of tolerance, that they're increasingly coming into conflict in our public square today. And I'm not sure I see a way out of that conundrum or a way out of that tension. But it's just something we're seeing on many different fronts. I just used that one example. And I think it's something we're going to continue to see in the years going forward.
How about you, Chris?
Well, I think Chris is right, and there are some really interesting analogies to be drawn to the past. As Chris has noted on other occasions, in many ways the circumstances for religious liberty have been altered dramatically. The free exercise of religion now in the United States has been defined expansively by the courts. The courts have been on a more or less accommodationist course since the 1970s, with some occasional blips here and there, and more recently some more severe restraints on accommodation, or more severe restrictions on accommodation. But some of these are the result of changes in the state itself, not so much in religion, although those matter as well, but also in the fact that the state does more than it ever has in the past. It does a lot of good things. It also does things that people might be troubled by, and that means that it of course comes into conflict with religion. Now, that being said, there is probably more space for religious liberty in the United States than there's ever been in the history of the world. Um, but as in the past, there are limits, and those limits are generally defined by our civic obligations, as they were for Roger Williams, as they were for Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, as they were in the early part of the 20th century. And so we are still in the process of trying to reconcile what exactly it takes to run that, the Roger Williams ship of state, that reconcile our religious imperatives with our civic obligations. Do we in fact need to believe the same things in the case of say, contraception or of gay marriage in order to function as a polity? Or can we disagree over those things and continue to sail? And so one of the things that makes this story of Roger Williams and religious toleration so interesting is that some of our deepest values are engaged here and probably will continue to be into the future.
So the last thing, oh, sorry, go ahead, Christopher.
I was going to add to that. I think Chris B made an excellent point that, one of the fundamental differences between today and the founding era, and we were talking about before kind of cherry picking things from the founding, and I try to suggest that that's not a particularly fruitful exercise. So one of the fundamental differences is simply the amount of space the amount of civic space the state occupies today vis-a-vis in the founding. And Chris B is certainly correct. The state does many important and good things. And if I give a quick plug to Paul Matzko's essay in the volume, part of what he does is deal with this idea of an administrative state in the 20th century and how that provides an apparatus for some to step on the toes of others. And so as it gets back to this kind of concept of a double-edged sword, as the state is involved in many civic endeavors and doing good things, it is simultaneously providing an apparatus for these kinds of conflicts. So when you think of something like the Affordable Care Act, and there's certainly many good things that can do, but it also sets up an administrative system that's going to step on toes. And so like we're seeing that now in the lawsuit I referred to. There's really no way out of this in the sense that there's no one answer. There are going to be, in individual cases, there are going to be winners and losers. And so the Little Sisters of the Poor are either going to win or lose their case. And it doesn't provide some kind of simplistic answer as if the state and its apparatus is wrong in all these cases. It does some good things, but it also sets up these tensions in other situations. And the volume does address that in one or two of the essays, as I said, Paul Matzko's essays. And I think it's just this notion of the administrative state, its potential, its potential in both directions is something that's is kind of at the forefront, I think, of some of these questions about tolerance and religious liberty today.
The last question I wanted to touch on was just to ask what brought both of you to this particular topic. Both of you have done multiple projects that talk about religious tolerance, not only this collection but other books. So do you bring any religious sensibilities from the past or personal history that led you to focus on this in your academic life? Chris, why don't you start, and Christopher?
I'm a Roman Catholic, but I grew up in a mixed household. My dad was a Protestant, Dutch Reformed, and obviously both Christian, but nonetheless there were differences along the way. Those differences were less deeply felt by my parents than they were by my grandparents, who harbored older resentments. And so I think that's always kind of inform my thinking a little bit about this sort of thing, and maybe my interest in the subject. That, together with an abiding interest in religion and the question of how we reconcile our deepest differences. How we accommodate one another despite those differences. Those are I think more than anything been the motivating factors for me.
Christopher?
Just the developing historical love with the early modern period that I guess began at some point in the undergraduate years in college, and the more I enjoyed learning about the period, religious differences, religious conflicts are central to the period. They're even if one is not a historian of religion per se, if you're dealing with the early modern period, religion and religious conflicts and living or not living with differences, they're unavoidable themes. And so since the undergraduate years, just finding the way that played out over the course of generations and centuries has just been fascinating. Ended up spending a couple years in a seminary just to study theology, just out of that interest. So it's just been something that I guess since circa around 20 years of age, I've just found exciting and complex.
That's Christopher Grenda. He and Chris Beneke are the editors of the book, The Lively Experiment, Religious Toleration in America from Roger Williams to the Present. I want to thank both of you for being on the show today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Claire. Appreciate it.